So, hope everyone caught Maria's role in that film, and it just gives a flavor. So we've had our first panel on the Bay, and now the second is on the Brooklyn communities around the Bay. It's not that we mean any disrespect to Queens. It's just that we are the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center after all, and we are focusing on the communities of Brooklyn. And by the way, in one of the, we heard earlier when Rebecca was speaking, we heard the term coastal retreat for the first time today. I have a feeling before the day is over, we might hear that term a few more times. And so as we go to our next panel, we are going to, we're fortunate, BWRC, because we have not only a great project coordinator, but Jasmine Blockburn is also going to be able to moderate this panel, and she has some very important credentials to do that. And it is, we are also served on the great BWRC admin, Ariel Lawson, who is making all of this flow smoothly. So let me tell you about Jazmyn. She is, as I mentioned, a project coordinator at BWRC. And it is not the credentials of her BA in sociology from Princeton University that makes her appropriate for this moderation, or even her master's degree, or soon to be master's degree, from the Sciences Po Urban School in Paris. That's Paris, France, not Paris, Texas, where she specializes in urban migration in city planning and policy. But rather, it's the fact that Jazmyn was born and raised in Canarsie, so she knows whereof she speaks. During her gap year, actually, in between her graduate and undergraduate degree, she participated in Cycles of Resilience, and more, that particular initiative is organized by our friends at the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay. So she worked with people on Brett's staff, and it was designed to make Canarsie a more resilient neighborhood. As part of that initiative, she created and led the Canarsie Street Team, a small community group dedicated to making Canarsie streets cleaner, greener, and more sustainable. And so now, without further ado, 1 minute ahead of schedule, I'm going to turn the panel over to Jazmyn, who will moderate a panel on the communities of Brooklyn's Jamaica Bay.
Thank you so much, Richard. Really nice to be here this morning. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Richard mentioned, my name is Jasmine Blockburn, and I'm a project coordinator with BWRC. And as he also mentioned, I'm from Brooklyn. I was born and raised in Canarsie. So this topic is one that's very important to me. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this morning's panel about Brooklyn communities of Jamaica Bay. So we'll be talking with 4 panelists who have just as much interest in and passion for the neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay as I do. Each panelist will present an introduction about his or her work in the communities around the Bay, and then we'll open up to the Q&A discussion. And as panelists are presenting, please feel free, just as before, to drop any questions that you have in the chat, and hopefully we can address them after the panel is over. So for our first panelist, I'm really delighted to welcome Assemblymember Jaime Williams. Jaime Williams is the current Assemblymember for District 59, which encompasses the neighborhoods of Canarsie, Georgetown, Mill Basin, Marine Park, Bergen Beach, and Garrison Beach. Jaime graduated with a bachelor's in social work from York College and a master's in social work from Fordham University. She has spent more than 8 years counseling women and children who are victims of domestic violence, as well as working with Catholic charities after Hurricane Sandy. She also led a humanitarian relief trip to the Caribbean in 2017. As chair for the subcommittee on emergency response and disaster preparedness, Jaime is especially committed to leading the charge on resiliency and recovery from natural disasters. Assemblymember, we are very, very honored that you took the time out of your busy schedule today to join us, and please take it away.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. I'm Assemblymember Jaime Williams, and this is a very important panel today. And I just want to say that I am so proud of Maria Garrett, first of all, and Harold, and also you, Jasmine, for doing all that you do for our community. It's so very important. So I just wanted to start off by sharing with you guys the Assembly District. The Assembly District is one of a kind. Our district consists about, we have 15 marinas in our district. We have many inlets from Garretson Beach to Canarsie. So our district is filled with a lot of inlets and waterways and so forth. As you guys know, after Superstorm Sandy or during Superstorm Sandy, our community was impacted really badly during that storm. And, you know, Garretson Beach, as I would say, was on the front line, whereas with Canarsie was on the back burner, you know, for so many different reasons. And I'm really happy that, you know, community advocates like Maria and Carol has stepped up to the plate, because this has to change. Canarsie has to be on the map, you know, because with the rise in sea levels, we're just seeing so many things happening. When the rain falls, with so many flooding on our street and so many things going on. So we definitely have to continue focusing on the Canarsie area and get everyone involved. I also wanted to share with you some of the work that I've been doing. Recently, we have formed the South Brooklyn Waterfront Task Force, thanks to the Jamaica Bay Conservancy Group, Alex, and SRRJB, Professor Brett and Scott. Thank you for assisting in that. And we are working hand in hand with the Jamaica Bay Eco Watchers. So they are the ambassadors for the other side of the bay, but we work very closely together with the Assembly member, Stacey Fefer-Amato, and the senator out there. As some of you guys may know or may not know, quite recently, Bottle Beach, that's right over by the Marine Park Bridge on the right-hand side, was closed due to contamination, radioactive contamination. So that's closed off to the public due to what's going on there. And I know there is conversation happening, because it's going to take millions and millions of dollars to clean up that particular area. So I know National Park Service is working on that. And we're happy to be involved in that particular assignment over there. We also have, in the district, we have an environmental ambassador program. So every school in the district allows 2 students to represent that school. And those students learn about our environment. They do a lot of cleanups along our shorelines. They have planted native Spatina grass back on our shorelines and so forth. And again, we have worked in partnership with Jamaica Bay Rockaway Conservancy, the Littoral Society, and National Park Service on this. So for me, it's very important to get our students involved to learn very early about Jamaica Bay, what it has to offer, how important it is for us to preserve and to protect our aquatic species there. And I'm so proud to say that Jamaica Bay, our water has been the cleanest in years. And we've seen a lot of species actually come back to our waterways. Very early in the early 2000s, myself and my family, we fished off of Jamaica Bay. We continue to fish every summer in the bay, along with so many others as well. So it's a source of just not recreation, but it's also a source of food for myself and for so many. So I just wanted to share some of those things. Earlier, I heard one of the panelists spoke about JFK Airport and creating some type of funding where, um, people that fly can be able to, to we can have a type of fund that will benefit Jamaica Bay. The first that I've heard of this was through Dan Mundy, senior and junior, and even Don Reapy. We had spoken about this, and I actually brought it to my conference attention. And they did give a little bit of pushback on that. And I didn't ask for $1. I actually asked for a quarter. So we're still working on this, and hopefully that can happen. um, so I was just really happy to hear that brought up, because if we were to have that type of fun, it would assist so much, with Jamaica Bay and all that we're all here advocating for. I also want to share that we've also funded Kingsborough Community College for a 6-week program offering a C STEM program for students in elementary and junior high school to learn about the ecology about Jamaica Bay. So it's a lot of stuff that we are trying to do, and I think the best way to keep this momentum is to include the students, the schools, and educating our community. If we continue to do this, I think people will appreciate the work that everyone is doing right now to secure our waterfront and to make sure that we keep our eyes to the ground. Last Over the weekend, um, for I Love My Park Day, we partnered with the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Conservancy Group, and we were at Canarsie Pier, and we had over 30 something volunteers. And every time that I go there, believe it or not, the landscape is changing. It really is. And we can see that the water, when the tide comes in, especially when there is high tide, that the water has changed its course and is coming closer and closer to the Bell Parkway. So we have to keep our eyes on that, and we have to, get people involved, because it's like one of the things, for us, we are paying attention to it for everyone that's on this panel, but we have to do better, and, to make sure that the work gets done. So I just wanted to share those things and thank everyone who is participating here today and who is joining us to learn more about Jamaica Bay, because we have to continue working hard and to protect our waterways, because there is just so much going on in our waterways, from the aquatic species to everyone having fun with our waterways. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Assemblymember Williams, and also for your efforts, to keep District 59 resilient and sustainable. I also want to echo, the gratitude that you expressed for the panelists, that have joined us today, and just their work and their passion and interest in the Bay. So thank you for that.
And I just also, I just
Sure.
missed one of my points too. One of the things that we have also seen that some of the inlets, the sand dunes have started to grow, which creates a hazard, especially for boaters. So that would require the Army Corps to be involved in that. So I'm hoping that we can work with Don Reapy and Jamaica Bay, Alex Zablocki on this issue. And we're also in conversation trying to clean up one of the marsh. It's called Sparrows Marsh. There's a lot of floatables and debris, but to get to that particular part, we do need a boat to go in to remove all those type of debris. So that's the other step that we're looking into and trying to take.
Muted, here we go. Thank you so much for those remarks once again, Assemblymember. So I would love to take this moment to present our next panelist, who is a very good neighbor of mine, actually, and a trusted community steward of the Canarsie neighborhood, and that is Harold Jones. Harold Jones has a passion for improving the Canarsie community and was one of the founders of the Canarsie Community District Incorporated, or CCDI, a 501c3 nonprofit. Before retiring in 2012, Harold worked for 15 years as a nuclear engineer with Raytheon Engineers and 24 years as a power plant design engineer with General Electric. Harold has been the president of Flatland's 8th Street Block Association since 2013 and the executive director of CCDI since 2015. He has also been a member of the NYC Community Emergency Response Team since 2015 and a member of the Brookdale Hospital Center Community Board since 2016. So Harold, we're happy to have you join us today. We have your slides queued up, so please begin whenever we're ready.
They cannot see my face because somehow I'm on mute. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everybody. They asked me to talk about the effects of Sandy on Canarsie community. Next slide. I asked I was in the road, so I asked her to do my slides for me. Next slide. Okay. The first thing we had to deal with. Hold on a bit. Hello. I think you're at the wrong house. Okay. Hey.
We'll just give Harold a minute, and then if not, we can move on to our next panelist. So Harold, if you're ready to join us in the next few seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our next panelist, which is Zachary, and Harold will come back to you afterwards, okay? So Zachary, thank you so much for joining us today. Zachary Paganini is a PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at CUNY Graduate Center. His research focuses on the impacts of climate change on coastal housing and coastal real estate markets. In previous work dating back to 2014, he studied how changes to the National Flood Insurance Program will affect the residents of Canarsie, Brooklyn, and found that a history of racialized subprime lending poses serious challenges to residents' readiness to take up flood insurance and to equitable adaptation more broadly. His dissertation research focuses on adaptation initiatives along the New Jersey shore, examining how the real estate industry will restructure waterfront profitability in an age of climate change. Zachary, we're very excited to have you join us today. And if you're on, please take it away.
Thank you, Jasmine. Please flag me down if anybody's having any trouble hearing me. I know there's some construction in the background. But thank you, Richard, Jasmine, Ariel, and everybody else who helped put this together. And it's really great to see so many familiar faces, Harold and Maria, who I've sort of been seeing and working with in Canarsie since 2014. All the folks at the Science and Resilience to Jamaica Bay, who I got to work with, everyone. So yeah, I'm Zachary Paganini. As Jasmine said, I'm a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center and a student scholar for NOAA's remote sensing program. So I'm going to share my screen for you. And what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about one specific Jamaica Bay community, Canarsie, which we've obviously been talking about quite a bit, and talk to you about the National Flood Insurance Program. And the case that I want to make to you today is that the National Flood Insurance Program is probably the federal government's most powerful mechanism for governing coastal homeowners' exposure to risk. But I also want to use the case of Canarsie to demonstrate that there are a lot of flaws with the flood insurance program, and to sort of encourage us to use Canarsie as a sort of way of guiding us in terms of thinking about how the flood insurance program could be reformed. So the National Flood Insurance Program was founded in 1968, and the way it works is the flood insurance program is administered by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which in concert with the Army Corps of Engineers produces flood risk maps, which estimate the 100 and 500 year flood elevation. And as this chart sort of helps to illustrate, the flood insurance program works as a market mechanism for encouraging to elevate their properties, basically where a flood is estimated to rise in an area. So every single person who gets mapped into high-risk zones from the flood insurance program is required to enroll in the program and pay flood insurance premiums if they have a federally insured mortgage. And then the premiums are based on the difference between the lowest level of the property and the area to which a flood is expected to rise. So what the flood insurance program is doing is it is encouraging people to elevate their houses above where a flood is expected to rise. So if you elevate your house, you will see your premiums reduce. If your house is below the base flood elevation, you can expect to have very high premiums. That's the basics of how the flood insurance program works. So a little bit of history, as you sort of might be able to imagine, if you think about sort of passing this program that's going to put premiums on lucrative coastal housing. At the time, to sort of get this program passed through Congress, the flood insurance program offered generous subsidies and grandfather clauses for buildings that were constructed before the flood insurance program came around. And so in a city like New York City, where we have a very old housing stock, these subsidies have been really, really important to keeping people's flood insurance premiums low. As a result of those subsidies, grandfather clauses, and also the fact that the maps for the flood insurance program often go decades without being updated and therefore are out of date and not reflective of true risk, the program has incurred a massive amount of debt over the past few decades. And so there's been a lot of movement towards reform in Congress. And so one of the big reforms that's taken place in the past decade is to start clawing back these grandfather clauses and these subsidies for pre-1968 buildings. And so, as you might expect, those cuts to subsidies are impacting places like New York City especially hard. So let's talk about Canarsie. About 83,000 people in the neighborhood, but that's widely considered to be an undercount. Canarsie is one of the more undercounted communities in New York City, according to estimates. And it's an 85% Black and 92% minority neighborhood with a significant history of immigration from the Caribbean. And it has the largest proportion of municipal workers in Brooklyn. Long has been a home to sort of MTA workers, a lot of hospital workers, healthcare professionals, lawyers. So this is a sort of working class to middle class Black neighborhood. And this is the sort of typical housing stock in Canarsie, 1 to 2 family attached and detached housing. And it has one of the highest percentages of owner-occupied housing in Brooklyn. So really, in the context of Brooklyn and New York City, Canarsie is a very unique place, very unique housing stock, very unique characteristics in terms of having a lot of owners rather than renters. So Canarsie went through a big transition in the 80s through the 90s from being a 90% white neighborhood that was sort of a white ethnic enclave, Jewish and Italians, to being as we said, 85% Black neighborhood today. And the period at which Canarsie went through this transition is a period at which subprime lending really took off in the United States, and where there was sort of a unfortunate joining of efforts to deregulate credit markets and efforts to include or end the exclusion of minorities from the housing market. And the result of this was that minority households went from being excluded from housing markets to being included in a predatory way. So what subprime loans do is they are structured in various ways to sort of prevent borrowers from paying back the principal and gaining equity in their home through extremely high interest rates, balloon payments, and adjustable rates, even penalties for paying back too early. And as we all know, this was sort of a huge bubble that took place in the early 2000s and that helped be the catalyst for the 2008 recession. And I want to point out that this is not just an income issue. This is really a race issue, that at the height of the bubble in 2006, Black households in the United States earning $230,000 a year were more likely to receive a subprime loan than white households making $32,000 a year. So when Canarsie went through this racial transition, the class composition of the neighborhood really didn't change. It continued being a sort of working class to middle class neighborhood with a lot of public sector workers, but the vulnerability of the neighborhood increased massively due to the subprime lending. So Canarsie accounted for the most subprime loans in New York City in the lead up to Sandy. And actually more than in 2006, more than 50%, more than half of all loans, purchase loans originated in Canarsie were subprime or high cost. And you can see that on this chart. And again, to go back to this class and race issue, you can see Canarsie actually has a higher average income or median income than Brooklyn and New York City. So again, want to emphasize that this is really a neighborhood this is a professional neighborhood. But the subprime lending situation created a ton of vulnerability. And after Sandy, Canarsie had the highest foreclosure rate in New York City. And so I want us to really be thinking about, how does the legacy of subprime lending, of this sort of robbed home equity, impact Canarsie residents' ability to be resilient and to meet future flood insurance costs. And one thing I want to emphasize at this point is that many subprime lenders sold Canarsie residents on the idea that they could afford their mortgage by renting out the garage or the basement area a future conflict with the National Flood Insurance Program at their house. So, as I said, flood insurance maps routinely go decades without being updated. So in Canarsie, in New York City as a whole, actually, the flood insurance maps had not been updated since 1983. And that was actually just a digitization of previously drawn maps. So this hopelessly out of date flood map is what Canarsie residents had to work with on, for example, the eve of Sandy. This is if they wanted to look at the flood insurance maps to sort of understand their risk, this is what they were looking at. Only 26 buildings in the entire neighborhood were mapped into high-risk zones. In 2015, FEMA and the Flood Insurance Program released a preliminary updated map that, as you can see, is a very dramatic expansion. So had these maps gone into place, Canarsie would have gone from having 26 buildings in the high-risk zone to more than 5,000. And it was the most dramatic increase in the city, which the city as a whole saw very dramatic increases. And we have to remember that this map, this came out at the same time as Congress was beginning to reform the program and get rid of subsidies and grandfather clauses that are really important to a place like Canarsie, to a place like New York with an older building stock. Now, I should note that this preliminary map has been delayed. The New York City essentially appealed this map successfully. And so they have been working with FEMA to redraw it, and it continues to be delayed and delayed and delayed. So this map got people really motivated and thinking and talking about flood insurance and flood risk in Canarsie, but it to this day has not actually been implemented. So, but the result of that, the reason why that caused so much controversy, the result of that map would have been that thousands of Canarsians who have never had to purchase flood insurance before, who based on the previous maps didn't know that they were in high-risk zones, are suddenly facing really high premiums. And for those who were sold on these basement rental schemes, for those who rely on renting out the lowest level of their home, they suddenly face a sort of paradoxical choice between really high flood insurance costs due to their basement, or you get rid of the basement and elevate the home, you minimize your flood insurance costs, but now you are missing that basement rental income that you relied on. So there's a real threat, a real sort of contradiction between what the flood insurance program asks of people for resilience and how people have come to live their lives and maintain their financial resilience and stability in this neighborhood. So Sandy and the legacy of subprime lending and foreclosure in the neighborhood have left these households underwater in many cases on their mortgages and without the equity to cope with these forthcoming rising insurance costs. And the RAND Corporation did an affordability study of a number of Brooklyn and Queens neighborhoods and found that Canarsie was the most vulnerable neighborhood that they studied, and that more than half of the community will be housing burdened if the NFIP map had gone into place, and if NFIP subsidies continue to be repealed. So in conclusion, residents in Canarsie are sort of swamped with uncertainty, which we found is really inspiring a sort of wait and see approach and low enrollment in the flood insurance program. So in the first place, the flood insurance program is, as I said, threatening to their sort of social reproduction strategies. You have a lot of elderly populations in Canarsie for whom elevations could really cause a mobility challenge. You have the high cost of retrofits and elevations. It's a very, the flood insurance program, when it talks about, hey, elevate your house to reduce your premiums, the program is not really designed thinking about the sort of attached and semi-attached housing we have in a place like Canarsie, where you can't just choose to raise your own house. You have to get everybody on the block enrolled in the idea of raising all of your houses together for often hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the uncertainty around when the new maps will come out, where those new maps will lie, when they will actually be enforced, and what Congress is going to do with the NFIP in the future and with these subsidies, again, encourages people to sort of say, look, this is threatening to my financial well-being and to my ability to stay in this neighborhood. And so instead of enrolling in flood insurance today, I'm going to wait and see, and I'm going to hope that some of this stuff gets pushed back. And so what we see here is that flood insurance is this really powerful tool. It's sort of like amazing that we have this program. It's hard to imagine Congress coming up with such a comprehensive program today, right? And so we need to value the flood insurance program for its potential to communicate information about risk to residents and to sort of motivate them to take action. But I also think that the Canarsie case illustrates that the NFIP has a lot of problems, and in many ways, in its current performance or function, serves as sort of a barrier to resilience, that the way it functions now, in many cases, encourages people to take a wait and see approach that does not support their own environmental resilience or their community's resilience. So when we think about the case of Canarsie and these contradictions between people's strategies for staying in their house and what the flood insurance program is asking of them, and we think about how the context of racialized housing has left people in Canarsie particularly vulnerable to Sandy and to not being able to afford flood insurance costs, I think that what I really want to advocate for is using Canarsie as sort of a blueprint case study for how the flood insurance program needs to be thoughtfully reformed, so that rather than encouraging a wait and see approach, it encourages people to take aggressive action about the risks that they and their community face. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zachary, for that very informative presentation. I have to say, swamped with uncertainty. I feel like that should have been the title of our conference. It kind of, really says it all. So thank you for that. Our final panel, or actually, no, we're going to go back and see if Harold is with us.
Yes.
Harold, are you able to present now?
Yes, I am. I had a delivery, so sorry about
Okay.
that. Yes, I am.
Wonderful, Harold. So we have your slides ready for you. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I need to present anymore, because sitting down with John in my backyard for hours and hours, everything I'm going to say is what he have said before, because we sat down and I told him everything about Canarsie. But I'll go on next slide. I call it Build It Back Issues. And Build It Back is a program that was set up for the New York City to get people back in their homes. But the consequence of that is that the residents couldn't keep up with the amount of paperwork, because there was certain, and whoever went through that program will tell you. So they brought in a lot of unlicensed contractors came into the city, and start working on people's home. And then the people find out they couldn't get receipts, so they never got their money for all the work they did. They had to take out loans. And to this day, we find out that a lot of people are not made whole. Basements are still not repaired because the building back requirements change every day, and anybody can tell you this. I mean, like that whole time, people were, and you really had to have a lot of patience to be made whole, because all of our homes, like my home was flooded, 6 feet of water and all that, but I was able to get it done, but I had to have a lot of patience. Next slide. Foreclosure issues, and don't talk about that. Many people had their homes. They will, and most people, or some of the people, they use family members to help them, and then they realize that they cannot. And when Sandy came and they lost their basements, as I think said, they couldn't pay their mortgage anymore. So that's why we have the highest foreclosure rate in the city. Canarsie has above average income, but the highest foreclosure rate in the city. And what is happening now is the real estate predators are coming in and buying the homes, using inferior materials, and reselling them at very high prices. And then COVID came and add another set of issues. But just the foreclosure, and because we are West Indians and we're too proud, we brought in a lot of people that will help people. NHS is here now, but we brought in different agencies to help people to save their homes, but they're so proud that they don't want to go and say, well, I'm underwater with my mortgage. So people are losing their homes left and right. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Flood insurance, I call it, as John said, flood insurance uncertainty. New flood maps gave Canarsie a high risk zone. They asked people to raise their home 5 to 6 feet. They asked me, of 1 in 22 homes on my block, they asked me alone to raise my home 5, 6 feet. But because I'm an engineer, I went to them and said, show me your calculations. Show me your calculations. They don't have calculations. So he said, send a senior guy out here and we could talk. And when the senior guy came, he said, well, you know, they hired these people. But people went on and raising their homes, as John said, and without a basis. They had no basis for telling us to raise our homes. As you said, we have an aged populations. Now some people have to climb 10, 13 steps. My neighbor, one of my neighbors, she had to put in an elevator. They put in an elevator for her. And she passed away recently, but an elevator, and that elevator is in the back of the house in some cases where people have to go into the dark to see the elevator. Our flood insurance has risen ever since Sandy. We're about double what we used to pay, what I used to pay pre-Sandy, and it could rise 5 to 6 times if these maps are approved. Next slide. What the Canarsie community is worried about is safety concerns. I remember having a listening session with adults, and their major concern is that Sandy could happen again, and we weren't prepared. And remember, when Sandy happened in 2012, I had just retired and I went on vacation, but I couldn't get back. But the homes were all flooded. There was no way of getting, Red Cross came in, FEMA came in, and we didn't have a plan. We didn't have a plan. And that's the problem. We still don't have a plan. And but and then I had a listening session with the 15 to 24-year-olds, and they don't care about safety. What they care about having better foods, have better restaurants and stuff into Canarsie. but I felt like CCDI had to do something about it. And I said, we have to have an emergency plan. And luckily, Resilience Institute got me a grant from the New York Foundation, and I set the basis of having this plan. We hired a lot of students from Brooklyn College to go out and document every industry, everything in every doctor's office. And the moderator of this program, she worked with me, and now we're able to see everything on the map, where the 100-year map will be. We know where everything is being, and we have a plan to put generators in certain businesses to do that. And one of the things that the young people wanted was better businesses. So we got together with we mentored the lady to form a merchants association, and they started, and they got the first grant through I helping them. They got the first grant last week. So we're trying to do something, but the after effect of Sandy is still a lot on people's mind. We know it can happen again, and we have to find ways to do something about it. Next slide. Post-Sandy, I call it post-Sandy rebellion issues. The thing we found is that everybody was doing constructions, and nobody wanted to pay to get the materials carted away. So what we found that the nature preserve, we found on the 108, we found dumping all over the place. We had dumping on the streets, dumping people coming from Long Island and dumping in Canarsie. We have people coming from Queens and dumping in Canarsie. So we had a tremendous amount of dumping. So I said to myself, what can we do? We have to find a way to give people ownership of their community. So 5 years ago, I applied for grant from the city council, and I said, I spent thousands of dollars and give people plants, flowers, and tomorrow we have our Saturday, we're gonna have our fifth grant plant giveaway. And all we ask them to do is to take pictures of your planting in your front yard, what I call the front yard, and send it back to us. And what we found is that we have reduced dumping in our community and the nature preserve by like 50 or 60%. We have so the little bit of $5,000 or $4,000 we spend to give people who want to form block associations. We can't give it to the whole public, but we want you to form block association. And we find that little thing that we do every year, we have reduced dumping in our area. So these are little things that we can do, but the big thing, I know all the stuff that happen at the Bay, but we still have to do things in our community. And John was right about that thing about we still underwater. We still have a foreclosure. We still have to deal with all these issues. But one of the things we have to get Congress. I just applied to Congress to have this emergency plan, $460,000. We got all the politicians behind it, but we have to do things to help our community. Gun violence, we bring in other programs, film, and things into our community, because these little things, we bring in art and we bring in all kinds of things as an alternative to gun violence. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Harold. And especially thank you for highlighting the important issue of safety in Canarsie. I know that's a testament to your background and your training as a former nuclear engineer. So thank you for sharing that perspective with us. We're going to move on to our final panelist, but this is just kind of a brief reminder to please put your questions that you have for the Q&A afterwards into the Q&A chat, and we will hopefully get to many of them at the end. So Ivy Perez is our final panelist. Ivy is a senior policy and research manager at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. As part of her work, Ivy advocates for policies that preserve and promote equitable, affordable homeownership in the landscape of racial equity and how community-driven preservation solutions improve access to housing for all. While at the center, she has worked on projects to improve access to and education around climate resiliency. Welcome, Ivy, and thank you for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm not able to start my video, but I can just go ahead with the presentation. Oh, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Harold, Jasmine, Zachary, and Assemblymember Williams for their presentations. So I'll go ahead and get started. So Zachary was talking a lot about people's wait and see approach, and I'm here to tell you why homeowners should not wait and see. First, I want to share a little bit about the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. We were actually created as a response to the 2008 foreclosure crisis to help low and moderate income families in foreclosure. And since then, we've expanded our work. We had a piece after Build It Back was having issues. We were brought in to assist with some applications and to help homeowners through the process. We also help with scam prevention, and we administer the city's new home repair program, Home Fix. I'm going to skip over my slides that explain more about the National Flood Insurance Program, since Zachary covered, but there are some other basics that for property owners are especially important. First of all, every building has a flood zone. Like Zachary said, buildings in high-risk flood zones are required to buy flood insurance, but flood insurance is also available for folks in other zones, not just high-risk ones. Claims can be filed without a federal declaration of disaster, but coverage is limited and it's not a guaranteed replacement cost policy. So what is a flood based on NFIP protections? It's when there are rising tides or moving groundwater, water main breaks or rainstorms, and a partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area or of 2 or more properties. So no flood protections are covered in any other standard property policies. So if there are homeowners that think, oh, I've got homeowners insurance and I should be protected, or they have insurance that protects certain pieces of property in their homes, that doesn't actually protect against floods. What is protected is $250,000 of maximum coverage for the property, and $100,000 of maximum contents coverage. Deductibles can vary. What is covered in basements is heating and hot water systems, central air conditioners, clothes washers and dryers, food freezers, and the food in them. So just the basics. What's not covered is finished walls, floors, trim, and no personal belongings and contents. So that's really important to consider, just the very limited coverage that basements have. None of the actual property in basements is covered. The flood insurance rate maps Zachary was talking about. So FIRM is an official flood map showing the flood zones and the base flood elevations. And again, like Zachary was alluded to, mapping has been a long process where there have been delays in when the final maps will be available. And that's where risk rating 2.0 will come into play. So the difference between subsidized and full risk rates are that there were discounted rates available for structures before the community adopted FEMA flood maps, so pre-FIRM. They don't represent the building's true flood risk, and they were determined with limited underwriting information, which brings about a lot of the problems that Zachary was mentioning. The full risk rates represent the building's true flood risk. The premiums reflect the risk assumed by the program and all administrative costs, and they take into account the full range of possible flood losses. So this is where risk rating 2.0 comes into play, which is that the fact that the changing maps were really encouraging homeowners, or continue to encourage homeowners, to wait and see where the new flood maps land before they buy coverage. Risk rating 2.0 is an attempt by NFIP to help homeowners better understand what their risks and their premium pricing is going to be. So whereas your flood zone will still determine whether you are required to buy flood insurance, risk rating 2.0 is a new set of variables that will be used to determine how much you pay. So this flood insurance pricing was introduced in October of last year. The rates for the new policies are going to start on or after October. Policies that start after that point will be determined by risk rating 2.0, and policies scheduled to renew on or after April 1st will see changes reflected when they renew. The risk rating 2.0 is going to result in a lot of premium changes for people nationwide. Some policies may experience premium decreases, and some may experience increases. In New York City, FEMA estimates that 61% of New York City residents will experience a premium increase under risk rating 2.0. The individual variables with risk rating 2.0 that risk rating 2.0 will use to calculate the flood risk are the types of water sources nearby, the distance from the coast or other flood sources, the flood frequency, the flood types, and the actual property characteristics. So nationally, 2/3 of policyholders with pre-firm homes will see a premium decrease. And as we said, about 62% of current policyholders are anticipated to see premium increases. But an important thing to know about those increases is that they're going to be subject to an 18% cap set by Congress. Those annual increases will eventually stop once the full risk rate is realized. So year after year, you're only going to see a maximum of an 18% increase until you reach the full rate. And so the primary thing that you should take away is act sooner rather than later. Update your insurance and pay your renewals on time. Renewals that are received 29 days after the expiration date or later must be rewritten as new business. So that means that other previous subsidies won't be reflected. And if payment is received outside that 30-day grace period, the policy will lose those subsidies and will also lose whatever path they're on with the 18%, and then the full risk premium will be required. Lapses in coverage will require a new policy with payment, and this applies whether the lapse was due to the previous owner or the current owner. Prior flood losses also count. They impact a policy's premium and will be visible on the declarations page. And if you have questions about the number of losses that are shown on your policy, you can contact FEMA directly. There's an example of what continuous coverage grandfathering could look like. So in this example, a home located in the low to moderate risk area, zone X, is moving into a high risk area, zone AE. Due to the home's previous flood loss history, the property doesn't qualify for the newly mapped procedure. But in anticipation of the home's higher risk, the owner purchases a zone X policy. And so when their annual policy comes up for renewal, they'll be continuing to pay that zone X rate. So again, the takeaway is act as soon as possible to make sure that you have the flood insurance that you need for your property. What's not changing under risk rating 2.0 is the firm maps and the mandatory policies and floodplain management. These are the management procedures that local communities have to follow. Discounts for pre-firm subsidized, newly mapped, and continuous coverage won't be changing as long as you make sure to renew your policy on time. And flood policies can be assigned to new owners, including the previous discounts. So how do you determine if you need flood insurance? You answer the following questions. What is my current flood zone? What is my new flood zone? Do I have a federally backed mortgage? Did this property previously receive FEMA or HUD aid for a flood? And what is my risk? So the floodhelpnewyork.org website, which is managed in part by the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, can help you answer a lot of those questions. So property owners can go to floodhelpny.org for more information, and you can see your flood risk. We have a feature where you can enter your address and get a lot of information about your property and your community's flood risk. And we hope that this will be a jumping off point to immediately figure out their flood insurance policies. The final thing that I want to say is that there's going to be more events that the Center for New York City Neighborhoods is going to put on. They're going to be similar to this event, except that instead of me, we'll also have housing counselors that have experience with working on and buying these policies for their clients. So if you want more information about Risk Rating 2.0, please go to Flood Help New York and add these dates to your calendar. And I'll end with another plug for the website, floodhelpnewyork.org. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Ivy. And thanks to all the panelists for these outstanding presentations. So now we have a couple minutes for Q&A. So if folks on the panel could please turn on your camera so we can see you, that'd be excellent. And I'm going to start with just a couple of clarifying questions that I saw.
I cannot turn on my camera for some reason.
Okay.
It says it's disabled by the host.
Not to worry, we can get that figured out. Perfect, there you are. Good to see you, Harold.
Okay.
All right, so there are just a few clarifying questions that I saw in the chat, so we can maybe start with those because I think they'll be pretty straightforward answers. And then if we have a couple more minutes after that, dive into some more discussion questions. So the two questions that I saw, there was a question for, let's see. So one for Ivy specifically, just about whether you think that the sea level rise projections will be included with other risk variables that you showed to understand individual flood insurance rates.
I actually don't know the answer to that question, but maybe Zachary does, to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so this is sort of like tricky ongoing debate, I would say, is that the flood insurance program is supposed to only, and like legally, is only supposed to reflect current risk. And so future projections of sea level rise are essentially outside of the purview of the flood insurance program as it's constructed today. And when you saw the big expansive flood map expansion for Canarsie, which I said the New York City government successfully appealed, one of the main things that they argued in their appeal was that that aggressive map expansion was actually partially accounting for future sea level rise, but it wasn't an accurate portrayal of current risk. So there's a lot of sort of ongoing like debate and discussion about how to give residents actionable information about future risks, since that is essentially not the purview of the flood insurance program. So one thing that's been done is those aggressively expanded maps are being used by the city government for certain things such as building codes, as the government does embrace that as a sort of accurate portrayal of future risk. But it's not within the flood insurance program's purview as constructed today to be charging residents based on projections of future sea level rise.
So actually a really nice follow-up question to that one. That kind of ties into what you were saying, Zachary, and Ivy can answer this as well, is how basement apartments or how not basement apartments are covered in the flood insurance policies or with FEMA IA. So maybe talking about legislation about legalizing and kind of upgrading these apartments, since we know that Canarsie has a lot of those row houses with a lot of subletted basements.
Yes, so the NFIP offers very limited coverage for basements. So no contents coverage. You can't, anything that gets ruined in your basement in a flood, the NFIP will not help to. Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, Ivy, do you wanna step in? You're on mute.
Oh, yep, you're on mute, Ivy.
Was just gonna say what you were saying anyway. There's very limited basement coverage. Your belongings aren't going to be covered. And other niceties of a finished basement are also not covered. So finished walls and the floors, which as you can imagine, can get significantly damaged in the flood, those actually aren't covered. What is covered is what's referred to as the mechanicals, the heating, hot water and central air conditioners, and also clothes washers and dryers and food freezers and the food in them.
Thank you.
Jazmyn, if I could
Yes,
say
Harold.
something, if I could say something about basements, I know that has nothing to do with the insurance, but I think they started before COVID. The city said started programming in East New York where they would allow homeowners to rent their basements out. But we haven't heard the final results of what happened to that pilot programs where legally homeowners will be able to rent their basements out. But there's no answer yet of that pilot program. So that would have the foreclosure problem if that came about.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Harold. And as I'm somewhat familiar with that program, I think it was a relative success. And I think the legislation just did not get passed at the state level, but they're trying to do something similar at the city level. So maybe we'll get some iteration of like an ADU, accessory dwelling unit legislation passed.
I can actually speak to this issue a little bit, both at the city and the state level. So the East New York basement pilot, which is also partly managed by the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, was working with East New York homeowners. And then shortly after the COVID-19 pandemic, which was also a time when East New York didn't have a city council representative, the city pulled all of the funding for the East New York's pilot, even though it was a commitment that was made during the East New York rezoning. So at the center, we've still been working on trying to find other sources of funding, especially for the homeowners that we'd already gotten pretty far into the process with, where we were starting to talk to general contractors. So the city's BASE campaign is working on two fronts. They're working on city legislation to hopefully have some kind of amnesty program so that homeowners can basically say, yes, I rent out my basement apartment. What are the changes that I can make to bring it up to code without getting punished? And if it can't be brought up to code, then the homeowner won't be allowed to rent out the basement anymore, but at least they've got like a firm answer on that. In terms of the state, the ADU legislation faced a lot of opposition in other parts of the state, but the New York City BASE campaign has been working really, really hard to get at least some version of ADU legislation passed so that the other very specific city changes can take place. And I can try to look for a link to resources from the BASE campaign, but they're basically fighting really hard right now with the state legislature to make sure that something is passed. So if you're an interested constituent, I can add that information. Sorry to do a little bit of policy advocacy.
No, it's all about that, right? That's how things actually get done. So thank you, Ivy. We are just about out of time. I just had one really quick question for all the panelists, which is, what is one thing that residents in neighborhoods around the Bay can do right now, today, to help mitigate the effects of climate change and sea level rise on the communities, on their assets, or in the event of another natural disaster like Superstorm Sandy, if that were to happen tomorrow? What's one thing that homeowners can do today to try and protect their community?
I mean, I would just say to start off, and yeah, great question, Jasmine, is to follow the example of Harold and Maria and really get engaged in your community and in talking with your neighbors and in going to these meetings and really being engaged. Because for one thing, there's a lot going on. There's a ton of meetings. There's a lot of engagement in Canarsie. But secondly, as we've talked about, it's sort of like, I think it's important to avoid the trap of really this becoming just one individual's problem, right? These are problems that entire communities are facing together. If you are suddenly mapped into a flood zone and you're facing costs that you've never faced before, there's a good chance that your next door neighbor is in the same situation. And in Canarsie, as I said, a lot of people can't individually choose to raise their house on their own. It has to be a collective effort with all of their neighbors due to the attached nature of the housing. So just really communicating with and organizing with your neighbors and being sure to avoid falling into the trap of thinking this is just your individual problem. You're being chased out of this community, rather to embrace your community and work with others.
If I could, this is Harold.
Please go ahead.
The main thing I noticed when Sandy happened, and that's why I got into this whole business of community, because I saw how our blocks start to work together, and we lend each other generators and stuff like that. And I feel like if there's 107 blocks in Canarsie, and I'm trying to let them organize themselves, because and that's the thing. We have to get information out there. That's why I started a newsletter. This is my 5th issue coming up, because people tend not. I agree with Zach that we should attend meetings and stuff, but if I can get the information out there, and have everybody share that information, then we will know what's going on. The information is a power, and we have a lot of things going on in Canarsie that people don't know anything about. So we have to get that information and start working together, as Zach said. Attend our civic meetings and stuff. Maria can talk about that more than I do.
I love these pitches that we're kind of giving for each other's community groups and information. Thank you, Harold and Zachary. Ivy, do you want to have the last word on this question?
I was going to say exactly what Zachary and Harold said. Really reach out and make connections to your community. I do think I'll say again, figure out what your new insurance is going to look like in with under risk rating 2.0, and also want to make a pitch for housing counselors. NHS of Brooklyn has been our partner in creating these materials, and they're very knowledgeable in helping homeowners through this process. So reach out to your neighbors and reach out to housing counselors.
Jasmine, I got one quick question I put in the chat for Ivy. I'm not sure. You just said the 18% is a cap, but how do you know when it's over for a particular homeowner? Like if I live near the water, mine might end rather than somebody who lived a mile away. How would that work?
So Harold, that's an excellent question. We are running out of time, so I'm really encouraging Ivy and Harold to bring this question back to the 3 o'clock forum. We'll have an open discussion, but let's keep that. I'll have that written down, Harold, and we can return to it hopefully at a later time. So I see that Richard has joined us. I want to thank the panelists again so much for your contributions, the discussion, your insights. Thank you for joining us. And Richard, I'll turn it back over to you, and he's going to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you very much for that great moderation. Thank you to our panel, Harold and Ivy and Zach, and to Assembly Member Williams. Um, we are progressing along. So we've had our look at Jamaica Bay. Now came the look at the communities of Jamaica Bay. I just had two observations. One, it was great to hear the assembly members speak about the program at Kingsborough, C-STEM, because as we were looking, especially at the first um, at the first panel with all those all the marshlands, the parklands, and there's so much at the bay, and it just seems that it should be a kid's paradise, and kids who want to learn to work there, live there, play there, and to see that there are education programs that are being planned, that are going on, is great. And New York is, by the way, programs like that are also good because with these new turbines going out, getting built, there's going to be more maritime jobs for people along the waterfront and on boats and into Jamaica Bay. Not that there are any wind turbines planned for there. And just one other second, somebody, a little editorial comment when Zack was giving his description of the subprime lending scandals and the awfulness that happened and the way in which that crisis fell upon the backs of Black folks. It sounded to me like it looks to Zack and others, I'm sure, as some kind of systemic racism. But if Zack were to give that talk in about 15 states in our country right now, he would have gotten fired from his job because such things just don't exist, we're told. And I don't know how flood insurance and the maps are ever going to be reworked in an equitable way for communities like Canarsie in the national bind in which we find ourselves. Enough editorializing from the moderator. And I'm actually, so now we're going to pivot.